For thousands of years, there existed a law in the Scottish Highlands that was not handed down by any king or religious figure. This was the law of hospitality, a strict social code that was observed by all in the Highlands. The code required all Highlanders to provide food and shelter to any Scotsman in need, be they friend or enemy. Once a guest in a Highland house, you will be cared for till your journey can continue. During that time, no harm will come to you or your companions, even if you are sworn foes of the homeowner. This social covenant was of extreme importance to the Highland way of life and allowed the function of that society. But what happens if you break the code? What happens when the ancient customs of respect and decency are shattered? The Flames of Kincardine. Sometime in the late 15th century, the Baron of Kincardine Castle was asked to mediate a peace offering between the Grants and the Cummins. These two clans had actually been strong allies for some time, but a dispute over land had gotten out of control, leading to a conflict in which each side lost clan members. Eventually the Baron stepped in and gave the men a middle ground in order to talk and perhaps put an end to the fighting. The Cummins arrived, led by a great giant of a man, and in the courtyard they came face to face with the Laird of Grant and his men. Between the warring clans were the Baron's men, who relieved them of their weapons and guided both parties to the castle's hall. There the Baron waited, tables filled to the brim with food and ale. As the Cummins and the Grants took their seats, the Baron asked if each side would hold the law of hospitality and agree that no blood would be spilled here today. The tall man and the Laird agreed to uphold the ancient tradition and began to voice their opinions on the land situation. Through the ensuing conversation, it became frightfully obvious that the two men were unlikely to come to an agreeable solution. As tempers rose within the hall, the Cummins no longer cared about the land. They wanted revenge for the lost men, some of whom were very close to the leader. The Laird of Grant began shouting at the man, telling him he was a fool. They had both lost men, and this was to be a talk of peace, not more death. It was then that the great figure who led the Cummins drew in a flash a ski-and-do for his sock, and sank the blade deep into the throat of the Laird of Grant. As the Baron and the Grants sat in shock, the Cummins leapt up from the table and dashed for the door. Before anyone had time to process what had just occurred, the Cummins had pushed past the Baron's confused guards and escaped the castle grounds. The fleeing men ran until they could run no more, but still they were far from the safety of their own land. Knowing that the Grants would be hot on their heels, and most likely have called for reinforcements, the only option for the Cummins was to seek sanctuary at the local church in Kincardine. The large man and his accomplices burst through the door of the church and took the minister and those unfortunate enough to be in attendance hostage. All entrances were bolted and barred. Now the men could only wait and hope. Unfortunately for the assassins, the men of Grant had caught up with them pretty quickly and saw the Cummins enter the church. The Grants guarded the church exits and waited to be reinforced. Before the end of the day, a great host of Grant soldiers arrived in Kincardine and made their way to the church. By the next morning, another host of men appeared on the horizon, flying the banner of Clan Stuart. You see, the Stuarts had heard of the assassination and of the gross breach of Highland hospitality, for which a price in blood must be paid. Now surrounded by the two armies of Grant and Stuart, the Cummins knew that there was no escape, and they had not the supplies to wait out such a siege. They would either die within the church or surrender to the soldiers. The fever of vengeance was high within the ranks of the Grants. They wished to storm the church and drag the offenders out. But the Stuarts cautioned against this. It would involve the desecration of the church, and it would be unwise to slay any man while in the kirk. Both armies agreed that attacking the church was not an option, but neither wished to wait for the Cummins to starve. A young archer from the clan of Grant would solve this issue. He drew from his quiver a fine arrow and speared a fragment of lint on its point. He then ignited the lint and loosed the arrow, which sailed high into the air and landed deep in the sun-dried thatch of the church roof. A burning scarlet line ran along the dry edge of the thatch, and within moments the whole building was ablaze. Screams and confusion was heard from inside as the panicked Cummins desperately tried to unbolt the door. The giant of a man threw all his power against the barred entrance and forced a gap just big enough to fit through. But as he tried to exit the flaming building, a Grant soldier thrust the blade of his great two-handed sword through the chest of the man, sending him stumbling back into the church. And with a sudden crack, the rafters gave way and the roof fell in. This brought the Cummins to their fiery doom. As this last bastion of security and sanctuary became a place of anguish and death, the Grants and the Stuarts celebrated the death of those who broke a sacred oath. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to all my patrons. Before I go, I have a few extra details relating to this tale. The first is about the sword that killed the leader of the Cummins. It is said by many that this blade became an artifact of Clan Grant, and to this very day it still lays hidden within Grant Castle. This brings me to my next point. Not long before this tale takes place, Grant Castle was known as Castle Fruki, and was the ancestral stronghold of Clan Cummin. It was overthrown in the 14th century by a force of Grants and MacGregors. After this, it would become Castle Grant, and the Cummins would serve the new lords of the castle. So although both clans were allies for some time, a deep mistrust and hatred was still held for the Grants. This may explain some of the actions seen in the story. After the events of this tale, the feuding and fighting between the Grants and the Cummins would end. Not only that, but they would go on to fight side by side for many years. Eventually, during the late 16th century, the Cummins would become the hereditary pipers to the Laird of Grant, and forevermore hold a position of privilege within Clan Grant. Thank you again for your time. Slán Живá.